Like it or not, video games exist to make money, and publishers, as the primary moneymakers, are often seen as the bad guys. They push tight development schedules, they pressure developers into crunch time, they meddle in things they don't understand, and they force the microtransactions. We've been so conditioned by microtransactions that those alone wouldn't qualify a game as being screwed over. FIFA is full of them with Ultimate Team, yet still flies off shelves, while GTA is notorious for them but receives universal praise. It's not just the money grubbing that comes under fire here though, either by insisting on in-house uniformity, constant meddling, ripping out a game's personality, or setting deadlines which proved massively detrimental. These games have suffered more than most at the hands of publishers. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 times publishers screwed over a video game. Number 10, HAZE. What a game HAZE could have been. Developers Free Radical just put the Time Splitters trilogy out, and HAZE was set to be another groundbreaking game with an original premise and insightful features. Unfortunately, Ubisoft wanted the game to compete with Halo, so it was shorn of all its uniqueness and sent out massively buggy to an undignified death. Originally, it was set to tackle the horrors of warfare before any game had ever examined them. Spec Ops: The Line wouldn't come out until 4 years later. HAZE had you playing as super soldiers who used nectar to enhance their combat abilities. The nectar caused hallucinations though, stopping the soldiers from seeing the true destruction and bloodshed they were causing. Hugely ambitious, it essentially needed levels to work on at least 2 planes at once. Free Radical asked Ubisoft for more time to work on these distinctive features, but they were told a simple no. In addition to not delaying the game, Ubisoft pushed for more sandbox-style features, without granting extra time to fix the game's core issues. Ubisoft eventually drafted in their own team, kicking Free Radical off their own game, and the end result was pretty disappointing. Number 9, Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor is a solid game in the Middle-earth mythology, which doesn't stick to the safe Frodo, Bilbo, Gandalf narratives. However, publisher Warner Bros.' push for microtransactions almost completely derailed it. The Star Wars Battlefront 2 microtransaction disaster could have made the cut here too. However, that game felt like a vehicle for microtransactions more than anything else, so it was really the consumers who got screwed over more than the game. With Middle-earth though, it was a good game which just had microtransactions crammed in. Thankfully, the backlash was so severe they were eventually removed, but they initially let a huge cloud gather over the game during its first few weeks of release. The Nemesis system, where orcs who defeated you got to rise in the ranks of the orc army, was massively influential. While not popularized as much as some speculated, it was a brilliant feature which brought the game to life. However, if you so wished, you could buy various orcs in this army to possess and turn trader. It undermined the game's greatest asset, and before long, developers Monolith removed it prior to the first DLC release. The sequel, Shadow of War, doubled down on microtransactions, proving they hadn't learned a thing. Number 8, Titanfall 2. After the first Titanfall was middling, the sequel needed to make a massive step up. In the end, it did exactly that, delivering one of the best first-person shooter campaigns in years. The time travel level especially deserves praise. However, at the time, praise was hard to come by, as it was released either side of Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. There's some who claim developers Respawn actually pushed for this window, wanting to take on the FPS titans. Others, though, go in for the conspiracy theory angle that EA pushed it out at a bad time deliberately, tanking Respawn's value so they could buy it just over a year later. If that conspiracy theory is indeed true, then Titanfall 2 was massively screwed over by its publisher, proving yet again that money tends to win. Number 7, Conker. It didn't feel right putting Conker's Bad Fur Day as the title here, seeing as that was a brilliant game with no real publisher nonsense. However, just singling out one post-Bad Fur Day version of Conker felt wrong too. It was the very character himself who was bastardized and focus grouped into a husk of his former glory. Originally made by British company Rare, Conker was passed off to Microsoft when they purchased the studio in 2002. The urban legend goes that Microsoft mistakenly thought Rare owned Donkey Kong, and thus thought they were getting one of gaming's most iconic characters. Given how they shafted Rare's creations afterwards, that wouldn't be a huge surprise if it were true. Microsoft elected to simply remake Conker's Bad Fur Day, censoring out the more controversial parts. Then, allegedly, thinking the character was too cute for an adult's game and too crude for a kid's game, sat on it for 9 years. When he reappeared, he was a goofy, squeaky clean squirrel acting as the mascot for Project Spark. Not the send-off he deserved. Banjo-Kazooie was another casualty in Microsoft's acquisition of Rare. Number 6, Dead Space 3. Purists will argue that even by Dead Space 2, the series had sort of moved away from its survival horror roots, but it's fair to say both of the games have a lot of impressive tension and that sense of dread. Originally, this was going to continue into the third installment, but publishers EA got involved. Knowing survival horror was a niche market, which likely wouldn't bring in massive numbers, Dead Space 3 was contorted into an action shooter. Unsurprisingly, microtransactions were shoved in any way they could. The conclusion of the trilogy was going to have protagonist Isaac suffer a full-on psychological breakdown, with a co-op version of the game featuring Isaac and a hallucinated version of himself fighting alongside each other. This dramatic twist was to be saved for the climax, and each player would have seen different things across their playthrough, heightening the sense of paranoia and psychosis. All of these features, unfortunately, were shorn away by the end, and EA just asked for as generic a shooter as they could get. The problem was, it wasn't a game ever built for this, and those who might have enjoyed it avoided it, while those who invested in Dead Space hated the new direction. Number 5. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. The game, which drove a wedge between Konami and Kojima, ended with the eccentric developer leaving the company and setting up shop elsewhere, resulting in Death Stranding. But one thing's for sure, Metal Gear Solid 5 would have been very different without publisher meddling. Metal Gear Solid 5 is still a totally decent game, don't get us wrong, but it would have been a different game if Kojima had had his way. With Kojima a perfectionist working without much oversight, the game was much bigger, would take much longer, and would cost more than initially anticipated. Konami viewed this as unacceptable and forced Kojima into several compromises. Things were so bad, Kojima was separated from his team, forced to work in a different office, only communicating through middlemen. Clearly, these are ridiculous working conditions which hamstrung the game's development. In the end, Kojima's name was even taken off the official box art, despite his creativity being a huge selling point for MGS. Playing the game felt a little sour too, as you knew Kojima wanted to do so much more with it. Number 4. Need for Speed. Like Conker, it's more Need for Speed overall, which has been screwed over by its publisher. EA didn't cut the heart out of this racer with a single mangled release. Instead, it was death by 1,000 cuts. The earliest releases merged car customization, realistic driving, and the fun arcade-style vibes with ease. They were brilliantly creative games which cornered the market with their own brand of racing sim. More focused than Burnout, more fun than Gran Turismo, edgier than Forza. The game was in a world of its own. The only game which tried to compete with it was Midnight Club, which ran out a distant second best. However, with that success came extra pressure and interest. With EA steering, the games became less about innovation and more about mass market appeal. In order to secure frequent releases, the game bounced around to developer, and with that formula, managed to lose its identity. Any attitude it once had was gone. As is typical of EA, the playthroughs became overloaded with microtransactions. Any sense of progress was stripped away, loot boxed up, and sold back to the player at a premium. Need for Speed Payback was the final straw, and may as well have been called Pay Up. Number 3. SimCity. The 6th SimCity game was simply called SimCity, implying the game was being rebooted into something fresh. However, unless that something fresh was supposed to be a recently set on fire pile of garbage, it's safe to say they failed. It came 10 years after SimCity 4 and 6 years after SimCity Societies, so there was a lot of anticipation. It's impressive just how quickly SimCity blew all of their momentum. Within a week of the game being released, Amazon suspended sales to limit the amount of customer complaints they were getting. Bad decisions on a publishing and development level alongside being released way before it was ready combined to one of the worst launches ever. EA were forced to issue a statement calling their own decisions dumb and offered anyone who'd bought the game a freebie from their library to make up for it. The problem was that the game required you to always be online, in itself annoying, but massive server disruption made the game unplayable. Those who'd gotten their hands on it early reviewed it positively, but once it came out, reviewers urged players to stay away until it was fixed. Number 2. Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. Divided proved to be a very fitting subtitle here. With Deus Ex Human Revolution rebooting the series back to popularity, developers Eidos Montreal had ambitious ideas for the follow-up. In the end, this meant the 5 years it took between Human Revolution and Mankind Divided was nowhere near enough. Though the publisher issues can't be detected so easily within the actual gameplay here, from the narrative side, they're glaring. Publisher Square Enix, concerned that the wait between Mankind Divided and the sequel would be even longer, decided to lop off some of the later story and save it for next time. This led to what was supposed to be a relatively open world being hugely restrictive in scope, while the narrative was a slow burn which finally ramped up into something good and then just stopped completely. Even without knowing the backstory, it was obvious something had gone wrong. In the end, low sales and Eidos Montreal being moved onto the upcoming Avengers game meant that the second half of the project never saw the light of day. It's tempting to say they got what they deserved, but really it's the players who paid the price here, and that sucks. Number 1, Anthem. Anthem doesn't really feel like a BioWare game, however it feels exactly like an EA game, which is why it tops the list. We know that BioWare is working on Dragon Age 4 right now, and with any luck that one is being made without too much publisher meddling. However, with Anthem, we'll probably never know what went wrong. After the Mass Effect trilogy, there didn't seem to be a clear direction, thus Anthem was born. Mass Effect Andromeda was rushed out by an inexperienced team, but BioWare's biggest hitters didn't seem to be working cohesively either. Casey Hudson left, then returned, while long-term creative director and game designer Mike Laidlaw and James Olin left during Anthem's development, taking a combined 36 years of BioWare experience with them. Reports of depression and anxiety amongst the developers due to EA's working conditions also surfaced, with a pretty decent idea as to why. EA's policy of "where's your ultimate team," i.e. long-term microtransactions baked in, as well as their insistence that the Frostbite engine be used, killed Anthem before it could even be born. Frostbite was a poor pick for a game of Anthem's scope and pace, but EA's policy of studio uniformity meant their hands were tied. That's the end of our list, but let me know down in that comment box if you can think of any other instances where publishers screwed over a video game. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm @JessMcDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more gaming goodness.